Fist bump, welcome back. I'm Faris, aka the Football Accountant, and today we are looking at Australia versus Turkey, the stats edition. So you can see I'm in a new studio. This is my new class for next year. So I was in butterfly class. I'm now going to be in badger class, but it's the holidays now anyway. Well, I have to say sorry, right? If anyone remembers in Makaton, I tried to film this video a couple of times actually. There was a few heat waves, which I know for people in Australia, they're like, oh, what's a heat wave? It was in my old classroom, it was 28 degrees with no air conditioning. So I was just standing there going like this the whole time, wiping sweat. So it wasn't really the best look. This classroom, the new studio, has air conditioning, which is good. And then another thing that happened when I was trying to film is my Apple Pencil broke, which I know is like the most first world problem sentence I think anyone has maybe ever said. But it broke, and it's not so important for this video, but when I do the film analysis, so the next video, I need to be able to draw on my iPad, right? And it reminds me of a story. So my last job in Australia, I worked in a GP clinic, and when the internet or like maybe the monitor or Medicare, like any sort of technological device issue would be happening, they would always say, "Oh, it's good when it works, isn't it?" And I would just have to do like the most polite chuckle. I'd be like, "Haha, yeah, like you can say that about anything." So I don't know. This my Apple Pencil not working just reminded me of that story. So next, I have some big news. I've been doing this YouTube stuff for like 2-3 months now, I think, and I've been headhunted on Instagram by this guy called Sam Russell to be the Cook Islands national men's head coach, right? Which is pretty big now. They're, I think, like 172nd or something FIFA ranked nation, but we all have to start somewhere. So I've applied for that. It would mean I'm a bit closer to Australia. If you can't tell, this is a joke. I don't think I'm going to get it, but I did actually apply. So how are these game analysis videos going to work? So first of all, even though, like I said, I wanted to get this out a lot quicker, when I see other people do game analysis and they're getting the video out like 2 hours after the game, I kind of wonder how much they've actually been able to process what's gone on. Like all of the games that I'm doing, so I have a couple of World Cup games coming up. I've watched them 3 times. I watched it normally live, which is like the emotional watch, and then I've watched it again for the second time and taken notes, and then the third time I've gone through and like clipped it up, so screen recorded, taken all the clips out, and sort of just double checked that what I saw in the first 2 watches was correct. Because sometimes I might be like, okay, clip this up, like he made a good overlap here and that led to a goal, or did this and he did it 10 minutes earlier and my memory might have been wrong. So I like to watch it 3 times, so that's going to take a while. And then the other thing, like I said, so the setup. So the first thing is going to be stats, right? And the reason I'm structuring it like this is because that's sort of how I would picture when I'm a head coach, how I would present it to my team. So we'll have our match day, and then the day after our match day, we'll do like recovery, like chill session, and I'll go over the stats for the upcoming opponent. Then the next day, before we get into training, I'll show the film of the opponent and I'll say, this is what we're going to train, how we're going to try to exploit it. And then the last thing is, for whichever team loses, is going to be, how can I fix them, right? So this first game, Australia versus Turkey, Turkey lost. I'm looking at Turkey and I'm going to say, okay, how would I change their shape? How would I change their tactics, right? And that's really important because if, again, I'm a head coach and I'm working on, okay, how can we beat this team, and we're doing the training after watching the film, then I have to say, this is what I would do as the opposition to counteract what we're trying to do, right? So it's not just like stage one solutions, it's also what I expect them to come up with as fixes. Now I'm going to give you the solutions to counter those as well. The next segment is taxpayer thoughts. So this game, Australia versus Turkey, I have quite a few friends, obviously Australian. I also have a few Turkish friends. So I've just asked for their sort of very brief, like 1 sentence, 2 sentence thoughts on the game. So we have Yunus, a friend who I met doing my C license in Wales, who's Turkish. He said, basically, we need a traditional number 9 to finish and provide space for others, but Turkey don't have that profile, right? I definitely agree with that statement. Then I've asked some of my more Australian friends. So we have Matt, who I played football with and was my assistant coach as well back in Australia. He said we parked the bus and went long ball slash did what we had to do to win. So that's the Australian perspective. Then Barish, who's Turkish but grew up in Australia, so he's sort of a mix, but he was going for Turkey. He said Turkey didn't move the ball quick enough or spread the pitch and failed to break Australia's shape, right? Again, I agree with that. And I just had that conversation with Eunice. So I asked him about the number 9, and he said, yeah, basically it would be good to have someone to hold up play and have some presence in the box. Right. Then in the same group chat, which is my old five-a-side team from Australia, we have Vinny, who's Brazilian, not that Vinny, right? But I've heard he's just as good on the five-a-side pitch anyway. He said Australia had 3 big centre backs and Turkey was trying to score by crossing the ball in the box, right? Which is very funny, but I agree. And then Barish said Italian coach goes 2-0 down and chucks on a right back and centre defensive mid, right? Both of those got quite a few laugh reacts, and sometimes in jest there's truth. Here we have Australia's lineup and shape. So you could either call it a 5-4-1, as it's pictured here, right? 5-4-1, or you could call it a 3-4-3, which we'll see on the next slide. So like I said, the reason you can call it a 3-4-3 is shown here, which is a pass map or pass network, right? So you can see the 3 center backs are here, then you can see the 2 wing backs, 6 and 8, right? The 2 wingers have pretty different roles, which is interesting, which we'll see in the film, and then the number 9. Now, the thing with these, you have to take them with a heavy grain of salt because they only show where you've touched the ball, right? Or the average position of where you've touched the ball. So if I took my 2 wing backs at halftime and I switched them, so he played there for the first half and then there for the second half, the average position it would show him is somewhere here in the middle, which then when we come to film, we would be like, okay, but he was very rarely probably in that center midfield zone. But because he's done the switch, the average is going to get pulled from those 2 into the middle, all right? So these are good, again, for giving sort of a rough outline of the shape, and especially with Turkey, I think it does give a very accurate picture. But again, you need the film, always, always you need the film. Then we come to Turkey's shape, so 4-2-3-1, right? You see the 4, 2 DMs, 3 behind the 1 striker. Now, this was fairly different, I would say, from what they ended up doing, which I think, again, using the pass map is just the best way to do it. But Gula tucks in, Celik pushes a lot higher, and then Kadioglu plays sort of in line with these 2 DMs. So he plays more of a normal left fullback role, like his average position, I would say, is in line with the DMs. Sometimes he gets higher to overlap, sometimes he tucks in, but playing a fairly standard role, whereas they wanted Gula to tuck in to give them that 4 in midfield, which then meant Celik had to play all the way up here, more or less playing as the right winger when they were in possession. Then again, Turkey's pass map, right? So we see the 2, right, centre backs fairly standard. We see the 2 DMs, again, fairly standard. Left back, fairly standard. Gula has tucked in from the right wing to give them a box, or just 4 in midfield. The shape is somewhat changeable. Then Barish as the left winger plays basically as expected, high and wide on the left. Aktürkoğlu, normal number 9, and Celik, like I said, plays high. Now, again, if you just look at Kadioglu and Celik, they look fairly in line. Like Celik is a couple of yards higher, right? But again, this is the average position he received passes. So as a right back, when you're playing out from the back, for example, you're going to be receiving it somewhere around there. And when they're in the final third, he's going to be receiving it somewhere around there. So it just drags everything and averages everything out to the middle, right? So again, you need film to understand, okay, was he actually there a lot of the time? Or was he spending 50% of his time up there and 50% of his time back there, right? Just as a sort of average rough estimate. Okay, so this is somewhat how the game ended up looking for the majority of it, right? Turkey had 72% possession, playing against Australia's very low block 28% possession, right? So Australia, we can see they're 5 across the back, 4 in midfield, and 1 up top, but they weren't really too worried about pressing the Turkey centre backs. Then we see the 2 centre backs, the 2 sixes or 6 and 8, the left back, right, left wing nice and high, the number 10 sliding slightly to the left. Gula has come in from the right wing, Celik playing really high, and Aktürkoğlu playing standard position, right? Now, because Turkey spent so much of the game trying to break down this low block, one of the more important stats for me is to look at where they were getting either in behind or into the final third, right? So here we can see the 5 vertical columns, right? So you have the left wing, then you have the left half space, right? And you have the middle, right half space, and right wing. Now, what Australia want is to have basically nothing come through the middle, right? Or what any team wants, but especially when you're playing, I think, against a low block or trying to operate with a low block, nothing down the middle, right? Then very little coming through the half spaces. And like we've already seen from the taxpayer thoughts, you want lots of stuff coming out wide and dealing with the crosses with your 3 centre backs, right? So the next stat that we're going to look at is final third entries, which is this line here. So it's not necessarily 100% indicative of where they were creating chances from or where they were getting in behind Australia's defence, but it does give us somewhat of an overview of, okay, where were they looking to progress the ball? Was it central? Was it in the half spaces, or was it out wide? Okay, so here's the stat, right? Final third entries, and we can see where Turkey got into the final third is what Australia wanted to have happen. They went through the centre twice. They went through left half space 9, right half space 12, and then out wide 39 and 29. So these bars, I would say, aren't even really the most accurate representation, because this number is 9 and that number is 39. I'm not 100% sure how that sort of works out. I think maybe it's measuring these two or something together to make a full bar, which doesn't really make sense. But this is from FIFA, and FIFA actually have some great stats in terms of, like, this, I think, breakdown is very good. I haven't been able to find it for Premier League games or Champions League games, and there's a few other stats that we'll get to that FIFA actually does a really good job on, but this is not really the most accurate representation. But anyway, so we can see, again, Australia wanted this to happen. They went through the centre very little, half spaces a little bit more, but still not that much, and Australia forced them out wide. And when you're going to be a counter-attacking team, the only real interesting thing for me here is, right, they have quite a few central, and again, when we come to the film, you're going to see Iran Kunda, the left winger, is given a bit more of a free role. He's allowed to play a little bit higher defensively and sort of get away with not doing all of his defensive duties, I would say. So watching the film, I would have expected a lot of left channel and left inside channel final third entries, but it was in fact more on the right. So again, maybe they got into the final third here, but he was the one doing all of the dangerous stuff, or maybe he did a lot of the progression and then switched the ball to the right just before they got to the final third, and then they crossed that threshold. So again, I'm going to keep saying it, but stats are good for a lot of things. They're good for, like, I can't watch 100 games in a day, but I can look at the stats, like the overall picture from 100 games, right? But when you're doing this, like, detailed analysis, you just want to use it to either confirm what you've maybe already seen from the film, or you want to use it to be like, oh, okay, like I watched this or looked at these stats after already watching the game once, and I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Let me see, why is it that Iran Kunda, who's, sort of seems to be doing more of the attacking, this doesn't marry up with that, right? So either use it to confirm or use it to give you a new question to ask when you then go and look at the film. So the next section of stats that we have is offers to receive. So we have total offers, which is just anytime someone comes and shows and says basically pass me the ball. Then we split it up into in front, in between, and in behind, which I'll use the whiteboard to explain sort of the nuance there. Then the more interesting stat for me is these last two, but especially the last one. So we have receptions between midfield and defensive lines, which sort of correlates with you showing in between. And then we have receptions behind the defensive line, which correlates with your runs in behind, right? So Turkey only received behind the defensive line 13 times, and Australia did it 10 times. Now, that sort of pass, or again, as a defender, anytime someone receives behind me, that's one of the more dangerous situations that you can have, because then I have to turn and run, and I can't really defend this way if I'm running back towards my own goal. There's also, like, I would say quite a few own goals from centre backs where that low cross from out there comes across my box. If I'm running back here and they can maybe receive behind me, it's very hard for me to clear the right way. So anytime they get in behind you as a defender, it's very worrying. And Turkey only did it 3 more times than Australia, and they had 72 to 28% possession. So again, if I'm looking at how clinical they were, they might have taken a lot of shots, which we'll get to, but did they really worry Australia all that much? Now, you can create a good shot without getting in behind the defensive line, of course, but again, as a defender, that stat is like, if it comes to halftime and they're constantly getting in behind our defense, I'm going to either say we need to play deeper, or I'm going to yell at my forwards for not pressing enough, right? It's something that is like very key. It's something that I sort of think about a lot from a defensive point of view. So now to the offers, right? The offer types. So we have in front, in between, and in behind. An offer in front would be either like here, a square pass between the two centre backs, right? You're not breaking any lines and it's in front of Australia's shape. Or it could be Çalhanoğlu pulling out here, again, receiving this side, right? Deeper than Australia's number 9, or Ismail, or Çelik, right? Anything that, again, doesn't really worry Australia's defense. Not saying you don't need those passes, because if you play here, 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 right, there's a lot of in-front passes or in-front offers there. But against a low block, you don't need these two players and this guy all dropping deep to receive feet. Then we have in between. So in between is anything, if I draw a line around Australia's outer players, it's anything in between, right? So if I played Tagula here, that's in between. If Çalhanoğlu plays up here, right, in between left wing 6 and 9 in that triangle, that's in between, right? Kokcu is in between. Ismail, if he plays a bit higher, or if I split all the way to my number 9, that's in between. And in behind, again, I think kind of speaks for itself as well. It's Barish running in there, receiving there. It's Aktürkoğlu running behind, receiving there, or it's Çelik running behind and receiving there. Next, we come to the shot map, right? So we have Turkey's shots and Australia's shots. We also have the XG, so 1.36 to 1.18 in favor of Turkey. And with their 30 shots that Turkey took, 12 of them were blocked, right? So XG doesn't take that into account. It just takes into account you took the shot, whatever happened after that is kind of inconsequential in a way, right? So 12 of the shots were blocked. So if you take away those 12 shots that were blocked, Australia would have won the XG battle, which again, that doesn't mean Australia should have won, but it just shows, I think, XG, especially in a one-off game, doesn't really mean all that much. Like even in a season, if you look at the XG table versus the actual goals scored, goals conceded table, in a one-off season, it can be very different, right? You can think of a lot of players that have had one very, very good season where they might have had like 10 XG and scored 20 goals. Okay, there's high variance. It takes a long time for XG to regress to the mean. So 30 shots, 12 blocked, right? But just taking all 30 shots into 1.36 XG total gives you 0.045, which is Turkey's average shot, or 4.5%. Now, the average shot in the Premier League, depending on how good your team is, right, or how clinical they are, ranges basically all 20 teams from last season fell into shot quality of 10% to 15%. So again, Turkey's average shot was basically half of the least efficient XG team in the Premier League last season, right? So they took 30 shots, which might sound good, but 12 were blocked. And then the average shot quality, like we can see, so many of them are outside the box or near the edge, very, very low quality, shows they weren't really creating dangerous chances, right? It's not even to do with the fact that they weren't clinical. It's just they weren't really creating that many good chances. And again, to put these numbers into context, right? So Australia's first goal, hopefully people remember, even though it's been a while, is that Iran Kunda goal, which is basically ends up being a one-on-one with the goalkeeper, is worth 0.4. And then the second goal, which is the right winger driving in, taking like probably 4 or 5 touches. He's here. Centre backs or defenders are, 5 yards off him. I would say that chance was worth 0.03, right? So basically, the average shot that Turkey took was not much better than that shot, the second goal that Australia scored from. And I don't think anyone is going to sit here and say that's like a shot that I would base my team's attack around. Like I would say, okay, we're going to create this type of shot loads and loads of times today, and I'm going to say we had a good attack. Like that's a wonder goal, right? It's not something that you plan for or build an attack around. The last question that I have with XG, which hopefully sort of illustrates why it can be good, right, but there's flaws to it, is would you rather have one 0.99 XG chance or 99% chance of scoring, which what that would look like is basically the ball is 1 yard out, right, and it's not bouncing, right? People have missed from there, but it's very, very unlikely, right? It's a 99% chance of scoring, right? Roughly, like you've rounded the keeper, you're a couple of yards out, there's no one between you and the goal. It's not 100% chance because there's no such thing as 100% chance XG, but very, very likely that you're going to score. Or would you rather 33 of those shots, right? Now, hopefully people have said the 1 times 0.99, which in most cases is correct. But again, XG doesn't take into account if I'm at 0-all, what would I rather? I would rather 1 times 0.99 because I'm probably going to go 1-0 up. And especially if I'm Australia, that means I can then sit on that lead. But let's say the extreme example of I'm 5-0 down, would I rather have 1 0.99 or 33 times 0.03, right? Which again is that shot. Now, the only way for me to catch up from 5 goals down, unless they go and score a ton of own goals, is to take 33 shots. I can't just rely on taking 1 shot. So again, statistics and the understanding of them, I think that illustrates, because I'm sure most people would have said, oh, like every day of the week, doesn't matter what, I want the 1 times 0.99. But again, context matters and game state and again, film. The last stat to look at is crosses. So this is purely crosses from open play, of which they attempted 20. Now again, I want to give context to those numbers. So I would say around like 18 of the teams last season in the Premier League were within a few crosses either side of 20 attempted, right? Now, their cross success rate ranges, but it was, again, I would say a lot of teams were around 1 in 4 of their open play crosses being successful, right? So Turkey have attempted 20 crosses, which again, it's within the ballpark of what Premier League teams would do, or just sort of football in general. But their only successful one is this one in the 87th minute. Arda Güler crosses it out here, and it actually ends up outside the box. So it wasn't, I'm not sure if I clipped it up for the film, but it's not even really a cross. It's more of just a switch of play, to be honest. But 1 out of 20 is 5%. And again, if we're looking at, again, sort of similar to the XG conversion ratio, it depends how efficient you are and how good your crosses are and how many people you have in the box, these sort of things. But 1 in 20 is very, very poor, right? Like 5% when you're looking at, again, ballpark. A lot of the Premier League teams are 20%, 25%, 30%, maybe if they're very good. 5% is so far below that. Now, similar to the blocked shots, right? You can use stats to sort of illustrate what was going wrong, or what questions do I need to ask, what do I need to look at when I come to the film. And for me, if I have 1 in 20 open play crosses successful, that means one of two sort of main things, I would say, and one of them is a lot more easily fixable than the other, right? It either means the people putting crosses in are technically very poor, right? Or not in general, but just for this game, right? They had a very, very poor crossing game, right? Which happens. There was a game Kevin De Bruyne played against Brentford in 22-23, and I think he attempted maybe 15 crosses, not all from open play, but 15 crosses, and he had maybe like one or two that was successful. So again, very, very poor, but we know Kevin De Bruyne is a good crosser. So I would say it can illustrate that, right? You've had a poor crossing day, poor technical crossing day, or it can mean you didn't have enough numbers in the box. Now, of those two things, right? Again, I looked at these stats after watching the game once and came to, basically it has to be, not has to be, but it's likely to be one of those two conclusions. And then I come to the film and I'm like, okay, were their crosses really poor, or did they not have enough numbers in the box? Like, I can put terrible crosses in if I have 6 guys in the box, which I'm not going to have too often, but again, extreme example. If I have 6 guys in the box, it's a lot more likely to hit someone than if I have 1 guy in the box and I put a bad cross in. Okay, so the last stat that we're going to look at, and then the next video we're going to be getting into the film again. So having all of these ideas, right, and like I said, how I would structure my week is we come in, we do a recovery session, I go over the stats from their last game, or maybe last 10 games, 5 games if it's like the Premier League, and then we go from there and we sort of start to build our game plan. So yeah. All right, so Makaton of the day, look out for the next video on film, and then the final video on how Turkey can fix it. Remember to be ready, kind, and safe, and I'll fix it for the next video. All right, cheers.